of course, like to introduce you to the panel for tonight. On my immediate left is Briohny Doyle. She's a writer and academic. Her work has appeared in Mianjin, Overland, The Age, and her debut novel, The Island Will Sink, was the first book to be published by Lifted Brow. And Adult Fantasy is her debut non-fiction. And it's out with Scribe in about a month.
About 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Well.
Keep an eye out. I think there's copies at the back. We've got Dimix Campbell doing books for us tonight, so keep an eye out.
The only available copies.
The only available copies. Get it signed. In the middle we have Yassmin Abdel-Magied. She's a mechanical engineer, a social advocate, writer and petrolhead, and was the 2015 Queensland Young Australian of the Year. She advocates for the empowerment of youth, women, and those from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And she founded the not-for-profit organisation Youth Without Borders when she was 16. And on the end is Timmah Ball. Timmah is an emerging writer, zine maker, and community arts worker. Her work has been published in Right Now, Westerly, Mianjin, and Inflection. And I'm Jerath Head. I'm the assistant editor at Griffith Review and co-editor of Griffith Review 56, Millennials Strike Back, which I just realised I didn't bring a copy of to show you, also at the back. And we'll be doing a signing at the end for anyone that wants to come and have a chat. So before I launch into the panel tonight, I'd just like to say a little bit about this edition. This is our Melbourne launch. Firstly, I'd like to give my thanks to Julianne Schultz, who is here tonight. She's the founding editor of Griffith Review, for the opportunity that she's afforded me in co-editing this. It's been a massive learning curve, but there's been some great guidance for me over the last 6 months. I'd also like to acknowledge that with regards to Julianne's involvement and the three fantastic women that I have on the panel, that I stand out a little bit, but also to note that that's not a representative, it's not indicative of the representation in this industry or any, and that along with the acknowledgement and attempts at reconciliation with the traditional owners of this land, we need to keep the conversation going. Now, Millennials Strike Back, Julianne might have a different idea. As with every edition of the review, it started with her. It was a theme that she came up with, I think, early last year, when we were looking at the impending federal election, and I'd been doing a little bit of research for a policy hub at Griffith University on young people and how they were being represented in the policies that the major parties were putting forth. As usual, they won't. For any, I guess, election and budget, there's always a number of soft targets, and young people are, to this point, quite a soft one. But the edition wasn't so much, despite the catchy title, Millennials Strike Back, it's not so much of an angry reaction to this whole boomer millennial dichotomy that we have going on so insistently. But it was more of a chance to let young people to speak, to show what they think and what they're doing, and give them space to explain the world as they see it and what the future really looks like, and why it's an issue. So, with that in mind, I noticed when I was reading a bit of Briohny's book, it resonated a little bit with something I wrote in my essay, which was about the density of headlines that refer to this millennial boomer divide. I think the quote from the first chapter in your book, Briohny, is, "I turned 30 amid a mediascape littered with the details of my generation's inadequacy." And when I was thinking about what's different about millennials versus boomers, that was a big thing. Is it's so present in the media, and more than any other time, I think that's granted given digital technology, you can't escape it. Maybe this has existed, intergenerational discord has always been a thing, but it's really shoved down our throats at the moment. And so I guess I wanted to start with some thoughts from the panel, why you think that is, why is it such an issue, why is it so prevalent in media discussion at the moment?
Well, in that kind of introduction to the book, I did sort of look at this intergenerational sledging, and, you know, there's great articles that compile stuff from like 1901 with like some reporter saying that youth today is the reason why marriages are failing. So it's not a new discourse. It's like, it's ancient, it's compelling, and we love it, and we love to engage in it. And I think that speaks to why it's so prevalent now, because of this, saturated, clickbait kind of action. And of course there are real issues in between it, but actually I think that there is something like that, it's content generation, right? And it hooks us into a specific kind of mode, and it does something for both parties, you know. Even if the sledging is one way, there's outrage from the bottom up. If the sledging is the other way, there's like righteousness. So it's cooking into all these emotions that we're pretty addicted to at the moment.
Easy tag to hook into.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I think it is natural. Like, I found myself saying the other day, oh, you know, kids these days, referring to like school kids on Instagram, and realizing that I was doing the exact same thing just to people like 10 years younger than me, and how easy that is and how satisfying it is. So kind of being like, oh, you know, we are like, they don't know how tough it is, right? Even though that may or may not be the case objectively. But it is sort of, it feeds into this sort of primal emotion around, you know, trying to identify with a group or trying to sort of feel superior. But I suppose we don't have policy levers to adjust to make it like that all the time. Yeah. Right? Like, and the numbers, I suppose, that it's in terms of the sort of size of the generations and the power that a generation can kind of hold, is very much unequal. And the question then becomes, is it such that, you know, typically you've got one generation, by the time they get to a point where, you know, they are settled in jobs and are, you know, looking after families and so on, things sort of balance out. That's what's kind of happened over the last, you know, few decades. Is that going to happen to us? And whoops, I'm not sure that is necessarily the case. So there's a bit of sweetness as well to that conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think sort of from what you were saying, it's almost like there's always, and you too, Briohny, there's always going to be tensions between generations. And I mean, when we all sort of met up this afternoon, we immediately started talking about how we didn't come from that Facebook generation. So we're almost already mocking the generation below us. But I think in terms of that clash between millennials and baby boomers, to me, I don't know, it sort of feels like there's massive economic disparities that they refuse to accept. And I kind of like what you were saying about the lack of policy to address it. But for me, the immediate thing is, I mean, there's so many, but it just blows my mind that there's a generation in this country who didn't have to pay for university.
Yeah, totally. And then get really upset when we complain about it.
Imagine not having to pay for university. It's, unbelievable.
Yeah. It's like deeply hypocritical.
Absolutely.
It's like, mate, you were at uni for 7 years for free. Like, yeah. I don't know. But they get offended almost offended if you bring it up. I don't know. This is, I'm just.
But that's the thing. I think that like offence is like something that's addictive for all of us. And actually it works to sort of block a conversation that's a broader conversation about these economic realities that are going to affect everyone. Even if you went to school for free for 7 years, the massive debt that a younger generation are taking on is going to come and bite you on the arse. Like the fact of an ageing population is going to bite you on the arse. Not as hard. Yes, nowhere near as hard. But I think that we are going to have to start having these conversations together rather than just being like, you. Yeah.
Well, so that's it's a fair point. So then how do we have that conversation? How do we say to another generation, like, see me and see how hard this is, and kind of put your expectation and outrage aside and like help a sister out?
Yeah, totally.
It's a genuine question, because I think if we don't actually have proper conversations, and I think in one of the pieces, maybe Jerath, you were talking about it, in the cycle of outrage, it is really fun to be outraged, right? You know, you can kind of get caught up in it and everybody does it. Then how do we see each other?
Yeah.
And it's again, soft targeting. I think we talked about the line that I quote from Richard King's book, whose title I've forgotten, is the culture where we demand not only the right not to take not to be offended, but the right to take offence at the same time. And I guess that leads rather interestingly into your piece, Yassmin, and your recent experience with the appalling targeting of many media outlets of seemingly inconsequential things. But maybe you'd like to start just by talking about your piece in this edition of the review first. You're looking at social advocacy in the digital age, in the Facebook age that we're in, and how it's differed
to my parents.
To your parents.
Yeah, so my parents from Sudan, I was born in Sudan, and they sort of, both my parents in different ways were involved in, social change. But social change in Sudan in the 70s, 80s, 90s was very much the typical kind of North African, we're going to overthrow the government, we're going to this, that, and the other. And so my mum actually said to me when I was in third year uni, she was like, you guys are so peaceful, too peaceful. We rioted. Whenever we were upset, we rioted and we shut the university down. You should do that. I'm like, Mum, the suggestion, no, that's just probably not going to work. And then kind of looking at my experiences with advocacy and in a way, nothing I ever do will compare to the physical and very prescient threat of being tortured by the government, being obviously maybe disappearing and so on, which are the kind of threats my parents walked into and fought knowing that was a threat that they would have to face. And so in a way, it makes anything that I do seem kind of not that big of a deal, right? Because what's the worst that can happen? The difference, though, and one of the things that I try to explore in the piece is that the style of threat or the style of attack, although it may not be, you will be tortured and all your family will be killed and we will burn down your village type threat, it's still a very targeted and a very concerted effort to shame and to bully. And I was thinking about it this morning. It's kind of like having a bully in the schoolyard, right? The biggest bully in the schoolyard, and the principal's too scared of the bully and the bully's parents to actually do anything about it. And so this bully's kind of left to wreak havoc across the yard. And also the bully knows everything about your home, your address. They can access anything that you ever say in any forum ever. And so, you've got all this information in the hands of people that really have no value for you or your life or anything like that. And how that actually changes the style of attack. So it may not be my physical safety, but it's definitely psychological safety. And it's definitely also giving permission for people who may care less about my physical safety to do something about it. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah,
and I think you reference in the piece that sense of not being physically endangered, but the analogy you give is, I think, being in the house with all the windows shut. You can't see the people outside, but you know that they're there.
But you know they're there.
There's this, and the overwhelming density, or the sheer volume of responses to these things that are negative is something to deal with. I
wake up every morning, and the first thing I look at is my phone. Because that's what we all do. And I'm greeted with hundreds of, pretty much most days, hundreds of messages on my Facebook, my Twitter, my Instagram, my inbox of, the fact that I'm a terrible person, I should leave the country, I should die. I'm called literally everything under the sun. People send me screenshots of guns they think I should be killed by. I get death threats sent to my PO box, my youth organization's PO box. For what? What have I done that is so offensive? I haven't even been, and so the fact is it is very personalised. It's like you, Yassmin Abdel-Magied, you are a XYZ and we think you're horrible and we think you should die and we think this and we think that. Actually, we're going to sign a petition and actually we're going to send a letter to our, local member and actually we're going to, and it's every day. And it's, in every social space that I engage in. And so people, I was having a conversation with a friend recently, bumped into her, on the street, we were having a chat, and she was like, oh, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I write and do other things. And she was like, oh, that's really great. I'm like, yeah, I get a bit of hate for it. And she was like, you should just change your mindset. Just, think about the positive side of things. And I'm like, girl, I don't think you understand. And she was like, look, you know, you might have all these people saying terrible things about you, but what you should do is just think about the positive side of things. And I was like, look, it's like, you know, front page news type stuff. She's like, no, that's how you know you're making change, girl. Just change your mindset. You see what's happening to you right now? That's you getting better, right? That's you taking control. I'm like, no, because I'm an individual. I'm not in an elected position. I'm not part of some major organisation that's going to back me or protect me or anything. I'm literally some chick who just turned 26 who has some, you know, access to the internet.
But of course, this then comes back to the nature of the particular people that are driving this criticism, and for yourself, you represent many things that they are not.
I'm the epitome. I'm like a young brown Muslim woman who wears a headscarf who occasionally works for the ABC. I'm like the packaged version of everything they hate, in a pretty little box. Like.
And of course, that it's impossible to extricate any one of this, and we were talking about this before. All of those things compound to make that just adding insult to outrage, I guess you might like to say.
And then I Instagram a happy face, and they just.
But I guess the question is how much of that is related to youth and related to the other factors. I mean, again, you can't really extricate any of them, but I guess there's an interesting lead into your piece, Timmah, which looks at a similar crossover between talking out publicly about social justice issues and the intersection of your age and your cultural background. Did you want to talk a little bit about your piece?
Yeah, and I mean, sort of following on from what you were saying, Yassmin, it sort of explores, I think, tension within feminism. And I think we see a lot of women in power. Obviously, we've had a female prime minister, we've got lots of female politicians, female CEOs, which is really incredible and something that we should continue to celebrate. But on the flip side, I think as a young woman sort of moving on in your career, a lot of the time those women in power aren't particularly interested in supporting you. And I sort of certainly noticed that in sort of the university sector and in jobs I had when I first graduated from finishing a Masters of Urban Planning. And I think a lot of it was for a range of reasons. I think class and capitalism comes into it, but certainly I think there was definitely tensions when women found out or knew that my heritage was Beladong Noongar. And yeah, I think there seems to be some very strange maternalistic power dynamics between white women and Aboriginal women in this country. And I was blown away when I was sort of thinking about these issues. A housemate lent me a book, Talking Up to the White Woman by Professor Eileen Wharton Robinson, and it just blew me away because she just articulates all these tensions and these struggles she's had as an incredibly smart Aboriginal academic, but feeling constantly scrutinised and judged and marginalised by white female academics who ironically wanted to save Aboriginal women, which makes it even more painful. But that book was written in 2000, and that really blew me away, and I think sort of really inspired me to want to address these tensions and why so many women in power don't seem to want to support other women who don't have power. And just quickly following on, I don't want to, you know, completely rehash the horrible stuff that's been going on with you, but I was struck by this ridiculous piece that Amanda Vanstone wrote about it. And obviously she's a woman in power. She's also white. And she wrote this amazing piece for The Age, and she just said that we're all equal. Like, Yassmin is the same as me. And so, and that, it was really amazing.
Yeah.
That she kind of was like, you know, Yassmin no one should feel sorry for her. She's being treated equally. We all get treated the same. If a man had have written something negative, he would be treated badly. It just that really astounded me because I think she just, yeah.
I mean, something I was thinking about when I was reading your piece was, why do you think that even when, you know, an Indigenous woman or a First Nations woman will say something, that others won't necessarily hear it, and they'll hear what they want to hear almost?
That's like, yeah, it's a huge question and something I think about a lot. I think it's complex. I think from my experience, white women in power, particularly in academia, seem to really... Well, I think it comes down to white saviour syndrome. I think they really want to be seen to be the ones that lead and save the problem, even if it means that they go ahead and plan an academic program or a whole subject and coursework on Indigenous studies without consulting the other Aboriginal staff or students in the faculty. Like, that happens so much. It's mind-blowing. And so I think there's this desire to be the first and to save things. And another thing that I've read recently is the whole rise of racial capitalism, and which is really interesting. And an amazing artist and academic, Tanya Canes, who's a Salvadorian First Nations woman who came here as a refugee. And basically it's sort of saying that white people are sort of understanding that to a certain extent they are losing some power in certain situations. So to get it back, they kind of have to lead movements. So in the context of Australia, they'll lead the Aboriginal movement.
Hectic.
Yeah, I know, it's very surreal and complex and kind of like,
That's really, the analogy that the only way that I can sort of understand it is through the lens of being a Muslim woman, where there's also that kind of idea of wanting to save. A lot of people really want to save Muslim women because we don't know how oppressed we are. And it's like, and when I was reading a piece, thinking of my mum, and my mum is, looks a lot more traditional than I, and constantly has complained throughout her life, particularly in academia, of people who she will be much more qualified than. She's doing her PhD. She's got four master's degrees and a bachelor's degree. So she's like hell qualified. And people will be like, oh, I just want to edit your memo because, I don't know how great your English is. And she's done all her degrees in English. And so it's a bizarre kind of... it comes from a good place, I think. And this is the kind of the tension, right? It's like people want to do a good thing. People are like, oh, I want to help, but maybe don't have a critical engagement with it.
Yeah, and I guess that is perhaps the topic for discussion, is how much of the underlying issue is class and a sort of a perhaps passive talking down. Timmah's piece is called Still Talking Up to the White Woman, so I imagine... And the book that you reference is Talking Up. So I guess what you're referring to is this sense of a talking down. And I'm really interested, again, we talked about the inextricable nature of these factors that make you, that draw response to anything you might say in public, be it age, gender, or cultural background. There was a really interesting piece, just to tangent for 1 second, that Julianne linked me to today by a young man named Kitan Joshi. I'll have to apologise if that's not how you pronounce his name. It's called Picking Apart the Media Outrage Bat Signal. And he actually analysed all of the media coverage of the response to Yassmin's Anzac Day post and splits it up via publications. A very interesting piece. I'd recommend anyone have a look at it. But there's a great section where he talks about freedom of speech, and he says we talk a lot about two ways of pushing back against words: legal limitations, such as race hate laws, and social limitations, such as being called out on Facebook by 10,000 people. Free speech is invoked for both legal and social restrictions on speech, depending on the position of the party being restricted. And so I guess that really sums up quite nicely the two different positions, I guess, when you're looking at the people who have social limitations imposed on them. It's by people of a certain class position, and it's when it's going the opposite direction, it's a talking up, in a sense. Any thoughts on the way that, what do you find the greatest underlying factor for speaking out in public and getting a response via age, gender, background, or is that completely impossible to answer?
Sure.
No.
I think they intersect in really interesting ways, and I think it depends on who you're talking to. I find, like, you know, in my engineering context, for example, my age will always trump what I look like or what my faith is or whatever. Like, the fact that I'm young, no matter how smart I am or what experience I am, the fact that I'm young will mean that the blokes that I'm working with will not be interested in listening to me. And so that was actually the thing that I found most interesting. And I mean, in a way I can understand, because most of the guys would be like the age of my father or grandfather. And so like, it is almost insulting to them that I'm in a position of influence over them, right? It's like, and class intersects with that a lot. It's like, you're some uni kid that's come in to my environment and you want to tell me what to do. Who do you think you are? So in the technical space, youth has always been the biggest thing. But I think in the world that I live in, it's very hard for me to unpick gender from race, from faith. And I think they actually are exponentially compounding instead of actually just multiplying. Because if you think of perhaps the way people talk about Waleed Ali, who's the other sort of main brown Muslim person in media, he gets treated differently because he's a man, and the vitriol is slightly different because he's a man, I think. And also the kind of view of Muslim women either being, super oppressed or a jihadist wife. Those are the kind of two options that I've got. So it's an awkward situation. I was like, don't know. Oh my God, if the Daily Mail is here, please don't quote me. I should shut up now.
Timmah,
Not funny.
Add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think agree with that. It's complex, and I think sometimes it just depends. I think gender definitely, but yeah, age too in the workplace. I think there's definitely that assumption that you're young and coming up, and I don't mind. I'm quite happy to be the most junior and sort of learn from older people, but you want it to be sort of reciprocal. Like, I know, I respect that you have so much knowledge and more experience than I do, but let's, have a meaningful exchange and sort of swap perspectives, but it doesn't always happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, right? Like, it's not as if I'm saying, it's not as if, you come in thinking all of your experience is negated, like, because I'm X, Y, Z, you should listen to me. It's like deep appreciation and kind of acknowledgement of experience and of decades of whatever. But like, again, it comes back to like being seen. I think all of these things, whether it's age or gender or race or religion, means that people find it very difficult to see you for who you are and what you bring as an individual, as opposed to all the other things that they assume that you are.
I wonder if in the workplace as well, though, like some of the stuff around casualisation and people's jobs being under threat and stuff like that, it kind of means that young people coming into a workplace and older people who are in positions of power, but yeah, like you were saying before with that example of white women feeling like they're losing some power, that older people might feel like they're losing some power in that situation as well, and that there's not the kind of set up like reciprocity and mentorship and the idea that you're all working together. Instead, it's like, well, there's going to be less and less jobs and less security for everyone, so everyone's a threat against everyone. And, then it comes into a really identity politics thing too, of like, oh, you'll get kept because you're young or because you're digitally illiterate or because, and that your essay really dealt with that, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, like, if there's, a sort of segment of society that lives kind of separate and whose income and influence is separate from everybody else who has to kind of earn a wage and kind of take care of themselves, and that kind of pie is getting smaller, that sort of whole conversation around inequality, then it almost suits the people who don't depend on regular income and all that kind of thing for everyone to be fighting at the bottom, right? And not actually paying attention to... I read this great quote, and I can't remember who said it, but about racism being a distraction from fighting bigger, more important issues, right? If you keep... And I would say similar issues with sort of difficulties for young people. If we're focused on fighting for smaller bits of ever decreasing pie, then we're not actually going to be paying attention to the structures that got us here in the first place.
Yeah, that's exactly. And that is really generationalism as well, right? Like if older people and younger people are fighting each other and like casting blame, like younger people are idiots and make the wrong choices and older people are greedy, then we're not actually looking at the structure that puts us in these places and how we're all going to be affected, and we've all got to work together and change it.
Exactly, and that even works within just the discussion of younger people, I think, despite the fact that we've written an edition on millennials, it's very hard to speak to an entire generation, and so who are we talking about when we talk about millennials, and what is that obscuring, I guess, for the experience for young people generally? Yeah. So do you think then that representation has a tendency to obscure broader structural issues? I mean, it's obviously they're both very important things to address. I guess what struck me about this was the Labor Party's recent ad for the visa, and what I was having a discussion with a friend the other day about it, and what really stood out in response, though, apart from how evidently ill thought out the ad was that a lot of what was the way it was responded to was purely about representation in the ad, and not about the fact that they're supporting, essentially the left-leaning party in Australia is supporting a very nativist policy. Do you think that it tends to get a little bit in the way sometimes?
Oh, it's difficult. I think it's kind of a bit of both, because I think, you can get caught up in, I think representation can also become tokenistic really quickly, and therefore not look at the big structural issues. So on the flip side, we're all laughing at that ridiculous Labor ad. But on the flip side, imagine if they made the ad and it was all Aboriginal people, people of colour, people from refugee backgrounds, and that was how they wanted to represent Australia. It would be so easy, because everyone would go, wow, Labor is amazing. They made this beautiful ad where we're looking at jobs for Aboriginals. And they would get so much cred, but would still structurally not be making those really, really vital policies that are going to create a better country. So I think sometimes, I know what you're saying, when you can get kind of caught up in representation and looking at that, but that sometimes doesn't really shift those huge systemic ways. But
I guess it ties back to what we've been talking about the whole time, is that easier things to get engaged in a debate about. It's very hard to talk to big structural policy issues.
And I think also it's kind of like that, from how do you go from diversity to true inclusion, and kind of realising that representation in of itself isn't necessarily the answer if everyone, in my like the way I described, if everyone's a coconut, right? So if I rock up and I look how I look, and people are like, well done, we've ticked all the boxes, we've got one person who is young and brown and Muslim and a woman, like, yes. But I parrot the exact same views of everyone else around the table, then I'm not actually useful as a representative, right? I'm not useful as someone who's bringing a different perspective, and kind of organisations have to be prepared that if they're going to include people that are different, they actually have to listen and incorporate ideas that are different. And actually how you get to a point where you can incorporate ideas that are different and challenging, it's actually a skill set. It's a lot more easier to be inclusive when everyone's the same. But if everyone's different, it's a totally different skill set, right, to be inclusive. So how do you, that's a literacy. There's the Scanlon Foundation does this survey for, social cohesion. It's like 80-something% of Australians love multiculturalism. But for most people, multiculturalism is assimilation. It is, we're a melting pot, which means everyone leave your shape and colour and size and whatever at the door, and we're all going to be part of a pot where we all look the same, rather than the very cliche salad analogy where everyone looks and tastes and feels different, but you are in the same pot. And so what does diversity look like? Is it being colourblind, or is it actually being pluralistic? And I also think, and we've forgotten, we don't have lived experience of great tragedy anymore, right? In this country, we've forgotten what it's like to live through a great war, what it's like to live through real, for the majority of the people sort of creating policies and having these discussions. So we forget that it can be really, really bad. And so we think that this system, the way that we've got things set up is the best way and the only way, but it's actually not necessarily. And so but because we haven't, and this is like, I'm making an absolutist statement, but we're not there are people starting to talk about it, but the questions of how does a capitalist society get us a better society for everyone? How what is the neoliberal project over? Is this like those bigger questions are actually terrifying because we have to come up with an alternative then, right? And geez, mate, I did engineering. I'm gonna leave that to someone else, right?
Well, I guess that interesting talking about the cultural melting pot and assimilation being, I'd never thought of it that way so much as probably from more of a nationalistic perspective. It's coming together under Australian values, whatever that idea means, a prescribed set of cultural mores that you have to adhere to, which I guess maybe segues a little bit into your book, Briohny. You're looking at the prescribed set of cultural mores that young people are meant to aspire to, cultural mores and material possessions, and I'm interested to know if you found in the research, Briohny's book is adult fantasy, and it's sort of, I guess, unpicking, well, it's your fantasy of trying to unpick what it means to be a young adult. And I'm interested to know what were the systemic issues for young people that you really stood out to you while writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been talking about them a little bit here in terms of like not being able to formulate something different, and so being stuck in kind of various old models. And so I suppose like when I started looking at adulthood as a construct, I was learning that it's a really new construct, that we didn't really think of it as something that you were tasked with becoming, like with acquiring these things and proving yourself to be an adult at various different times. You just were. Like no one was having a discussion about it. And how those various different like milestones or goals of adulthood are structured economically, and also how they feed into our kind of economic responsibility. So, I mean, we've already talked a little bit about like free education, so that's a thing, but also, you know, I guess for people coming into education now, or when we were going into university, you know, however long ago, that was also being sold as like, buy your adult future, right? Like become engineer or writer or urban planner or whatever. And if you came out the other end of that and you hadn't acquired that identity, then it was seen to be somehow like not successful or something. So I guess I was just kind of looking at the various ways that, you know, just because we think those things, that doesn't really mean that they have a tangible existence, you know.
Did it change your... Because you start off the book sort of wondering whether you're a true adult. Did it change your perspective on what becoming a true adult will be?
Yeah, it definitely did. Like it calmed me down quite a lot, like looking at these things and unpicking them, because I definitely internalised some of those ideas about being a kidult and like failing to grow up in various ways, but it was because there wasn't a conversation about maturity that was different from this like acquiring stuff, you know, succeeding in this really material and you know, you can fill it out, you know, you can tick boxes. So I guess I started having that conversation, you know, during my research and with other people, and finding that lots of people really feel this way, and that it kind of creates a lot of anxiety. But that anxiety also feeds back into these consumer patterns, right? Like, so if you feel that you haven't succeeded at X bit of adultness, then you can kind of work your way around it by spending money here or by like aspiring over here. Yeah, so it was good to kind of unpick that for sure.
Yeah. And your piece in the review it's an edited extract from Adult Fantasy, and it's devoted to housing in your research into buying a house, your attempts to buy a house, and it's a very interesting topic. I think that intergenerational discussion seems to focus around, particularly with the budget. Young people getting into the housing market, and I'm very interested to know from yourself, Briohny, and from Yassmin, Timmah, why you think that is such a focal point for intergenerational discussion and policy making.
So I think like the thing about housing is that it is a really concrete example of the stuff that we're talking about here, right? Like, so real estate consolidates class. Like, if you are going to inherit a property, or if you have a property already and it's developing equity, then it's consolidating class. If you don't, and your parents or your grandparents aren't going to give you any money, then you are locked out of the housing market. That has some problems that are to do with class mobility, but also later on to do with retirement, or what happens if you get sick, all of these kinds of things, but also that lock into how we treat people who don't have certain things in Australia. I can't speak to what it's like to be a renter in the UK or America necessarily, but in Australia you don't really have any rights as a renter, so you kind of have all of these vulnerabilities that you wouldn't otherwise have. So I think like housing unaffordability is like a buzz topic, because you could design legislation to sort it out, like you could, it's not happening, but you could. It's concrete, everyone can see that it's real. It's not the same as talking about things that might be a little bit more ethereal or a little bit more complex. Like, it's obvious to say, I cannot afford to buy a house, and it means a whole bunch of other things that can be clearly kind of pulled out from that.
I would almost say that it's like the Australian rite of passage, right, for adult, like it's treated as a rite of passage for adulthood. Like in lots of other cultures, particularly Eastern cultures, I can only speak for North Africa, but you know, in order to become an adult, you go through a rite of passage, whether that's something to do with like a tribal village ceremony, to you know, having a child for women, for example. But there are specific kind of rites of passage. Before you were a child, you've gone through this process, and now you're an adult. And in Australia, the kind of conversation has been around buying a house is like when you have it. In many contexts, in the it's when you kind of have achieved adulthood in some conversations, but it means that there's a whole bunch of us that aren't necessarily going to easily see that as achievable, and also the kind of insecurity that comes around. It was interesting, the piece around being a renter, and you're sort of living your life in 12-month blocks, and the fact that that you're judged on all these sorts of things. And you're accountable to a stranger for all these sorts of things. You have someone coming and checking your house every couple of months and so on. Like, it's an odd thing when you think about it objectively, for a grown person with, you know, with everything else kind of looked after, or essentially they're living their life, and then you have somebody else coming and saying, well, actually, this is not good enough. It's an odd thing to put people through.
And even the process of applying for a house, if you're renting a house, right, you have to perform a certain kind of adulthood. Like, you can't let the bits that don't fit this picture show, or you're not going to get the house. That, in addition to doing like illegal things like bidding higher on the rental auction, even though that's not a legal thing, it's a common reality for people. Yeah.
I assume everyone here is renting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just a check.
I know, I secretly have 5 houses.
Yeah, I'm renting, but I've got 8 or 9 investment properties.
I mean, there's an interesting, for migrants as well, like a lot of my family friends who, you know, they moved to Australia, they didn't have they didn't have references that were in Australia, for example. So they may have been coming as like established families, and all of a sudden the system kind of treats you like a child again, and you have to find someone to say, you know, and it can, you can see why the system is designed that way, but it actually has all these other effects. And because it's it's about your identity, it's about your person, it can be weirdly destabilising.
Yeah. Timmah, I'm interested to know if you have anything to add, as your work is primarily an urban planner.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating and really troubling. I guess for me, particularly in the context of issues like gentrification and the desirability of the inner city, I think for me, I don't know, I always am very, I guess, hurt and to the extent that we tend to not really look at the context of that this land was never ceded, and the impact that this has on Aboriginal communities who really have an inalienable connection to sort of Fitzroy, and in Sydney it's sort of Redfern and Waterloo. And I don't know, I think it's a shame that we're not really centering those voices in the debate. Because when I think about things that Uncle Jack Charles has said, Fitzroy isn't just about, you know, it's not just a great place to live because it's beautiful and sexy and exciting. For him, because he was shoved away in crappy orphanages, that's how he worked out who he was, by going to pubs in Fitzroy. So if we don't make sure that these places remain affordable and accessible for Aboriginal communities because it's their land, then yeah, we really need to, I don't know, reassess our own privileges.
Yeah. I think we could go on for quite some time if we start getting topical, in particularly surrounding the budget, but we'll throw to questions in a minute. I find a lot of these discussions take quite a lugubrious tone. There's not a lot of... Everyone keeps asking me, is Gen Y an optimistic generation? And my answer is always, I want to say yes, but the discussions I have, it often feels like not. But I think that's when you're talking broad, the tendency is to get a bit despairing. But when we talk a bit more localised, there's a lot of great things we're doing. And this was the point of the edition, was to show the way people are doing things and the way they're approaching things as a positive examples. And so just quickly, I was hoping, Timmah, you finish your piece with some examples of women writers who really inspire you. I was hoping in a couple of minutes if you guys could give an example of somewhere that people might want to look for some optimism.
In a really sort of cheeky black humour kind of way, I love New Kagori. She's
so great.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Hannah Donnelly is another amazing rising Wiradjuri writer. Paula Bella, Ellen Van Nieuwen, obviously, brilliant. So I know what you're saying, there is a lot of negativity, but yeah, when you think of the young talent, it's actually really exciting, I think.
Yeah, all of those. I actually, sort of beyond that as well, I get a lot of inspiration more like in the sort of Muslim and sort of brown women's space from the States. And there's a website called muslimgirl.com, that features a whole bunch of like awesome young female Muslims, and they are sharp and funny and, don't take... take no prisoners, essentially. And I think that's awesome. And I look at the likes of Roxane Gay, and sometimes I'll just essentially, kind of cruise around on Twitter and, look at what these, like, 12-year-old kids are saying. And I'm like, yes, if the world isn't, like, you know what intersectionality is and you're a child. I just learnt that. And so I'm really inspired by the fact that there are young people kind of in Australia and around the world engaging in issues that, and using language that I only really recently kind of came to terms with. So even though there are people that have written about this stuff 20, 30 years ago, and it's still totally, it feels like it was written yesterday, there's also, I feel like, pretty great steps.
I feel like when I read this issue of Griffith Review and when I read the Brow and stuff, it's not like people are being negative. I think that what I see is like a pragmatism and a desire to like get in there and discuss these issues. Yeah. So I don't think that it's a lack of optimism. I think that it's realists, having an important chat, and getting ready to do whatever comes next. And I like take a lot of inspiration from that.
Yeah, and I think I tried to address that a little bit in the piece that I wrote, which was that the ability to have the discussions is really an increasing source of optimism, I think, for young people. And on that note, we'll throw to questions. We don't have a whole lot of time, so if anyone does have one, if they could keep it relatively short, that'd be great. We've got a couple of roving mics, so just throw your hands up and we'll...
Hi. I found it really interesting that, Yassmin, you said that, it's a rite of passage for Australians to own a home. Owning a home is the Australian dream. It's referred to as the Australian dream. So for young people to make a decision just based on a practical reality that you can't afford to buy a house. For example, I'm single, I'm 31, I live alone, I rent. I cannot afford to buy a house. But it's not just making a practical decision, it's actually giving up something that's part of our national identity to some extent. So not really a question, more a statement, but I thought it's very, very loaded, that decision not to buy a home.
And I think, it goes to the question of who we are as a nation, right? And we're still a relatively, in the modern sense, and I think one of the things we haven't done at all is deal with our sort of history beyond a couple of hundred years. But if you look at the sort of modern sense, we're still a teenager nation, right? We still haven't figured out who we are. We don't like people telling us we're doing anything wrong. We don't like, and so, but for a long time, the Australian dream has been that. And if it's no longer accessible, what does that mean?
But also I think like we need to get critical about these narratives, right? These narratives of nationhood and these narratives of identity. Like for sure, okay, so we could see the Great Australian Dream as being that, you know, coming into adulthood, that's our birthright or whatever, but what was that constructed on? Why was that constructed? It was constructed at a time when we really needed people to develop cities in Australia. We really needed all of this economic work to get done. We really needed to ignore a bunch of issues like native title. But you know, now something is changing. So we need to acknowledge that that narrative is not even just outdated, but it comes against what the next thing will be. Yeah.
And it perhaps happened at a time where, I mean, cities have always been centres for capital, but this great influx of, you know, this collapse of remote communities and the idea that we can still own a home, but we increasingly have to accumulate around city centres and capital means that, it undermines that whole narrative, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at parts of Europe and heaps of places where they don't have that narrative, right? And everyone's totally fine renting their homes, but they're more protected and they've got more long-term leases and, you know, it's a different kind of story. It doesn't make them feel like they're children, but it is this story that we're telling ourselves and we've got to kind of be critical about them and kind of excavate the economic underpinnings of them.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
You mentioned earlier that you all thought you were a little too old to be part of the Facebook generation. As someone who is part of the Facebook generation, I suppose, I'm interested to know, like, what do you think of, you know, the very young people, i.e. me, and how they communicate through social media, almost more or less, and especially with you, Yassmin, seeing the full impact of social media and how it can personally affect you on a very macro scale for you, but on a micro level for, you know, interactions with people at school and people with just friends in general, and how that can affect people's lives.
Do you mind? So I think it's really interesting because I'm probably on the cusp, right? So Facebook probably came into like full swing when I was at university, which meant I didn't have it at school, but it was a big part of kind of my maturing. And I think the interesting thing for me in all of that is, I think it would be terrifying to be at school now because the rules of social media and the way that you have conversations on things like Instagram and so on make all of the issues that we dealt with, you know, in terms of bullying and so on, so much more terrifying and pervasive. I personally have a lot of respect for kids or for younger people that have to kind of like grow up in this world. But I also think that what is happening is previous generations are applying their rules of how they communicate to social media, which operates on a different, in a different sense, right? So I will put anything I think on Twitter, right? Because that's how everyone I know operates. But the wider world, run by people who are much older than I, see that as everything you put on Twitter, Yassmin, is like a press release, right? And we're going to treat it thus. And if you say something kind of satirically like X and Y is white AF, we're going to take that as an attack, right? Rather than as, you know, a social commentary. That's something that people of your generation will understand. And so the communication styles are completely different, and I'm not sure how it's going to play out because I think the power is so bent towards older styles of communication applying to new forms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think for me it's a love-hate relationship. I think Facebook would have been petrifying in high school, like we were sort of saying, but it also helps people. I mean, I think of organisations like Warriors of Aboriginal Resistance, Seed Mob. They do so much organising via Facebook and social media and sort of can shut down the central city and make a point through rallying people on Facebook. So from that perspective, you think it's a tool that can be used for social justice reasons. But, you know, obviously, as you would know more than anyone, it can be used to destroy personalities and people. And,
I think that's a good point, and that ties into your piece, Yassmin, the potential for it, the way it differs to traditional activism and the huge potential it has to bring people together around causes like that. Pretty much every rally I ever go to now is organised on Facebook.
It's an amplifier, right? It's a huge amplifier. So the highs are super high and the lows are like hectic, right? So I would say like that's difficult for people who aren't native to that to understand, I think.
And just as a slight aside, I think it touches on a point that we really didn't get a chance to look at, that I've seen a few pieces floating around on, which is the difference between old and young millennials, because of course, we were talking about it earlier, there's certain people that maybe don't feel as digital native, if you like, which, as we discussed, revolves more around the time the internet really came to dominate our lives. And so for the older millennials, there's a sense in which there's a division within that category. I guess highlights the issues of that categorisation anyway, but any other questions?
Hi, thank you for such a great discussion. I was very interested in what you were saying about being a young person in the workplace in particular, and I was wondering if any of you had any advice for millennials how to be seen and heard and respected in the workplace by baby boomers, particularly maybe if you are in a position of power over them or like in a higher position. If you had any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for me, it just sort of goes back to what I was saying, is I just think just better relationships, and I think sometimes it's luck. I mean, I know people who just have great work cultures, so there's not a big distinction between executive directors and junior staff or people in grad positions, and everyone's considered to be part of the team. I think when you're sort of young and starting out in a professional environment, it can be overwhelmingly strange and intimidating. I think I really felt anxious in my first sort of proper adult job. But I think it's just about doing your best to sort of find colleagues who are like-minded and maybe even just a little bit more senior than you are, to get advice and mentoring, and even seeking mentors outside of your professional environment. And I think it would just be great if people in positions of power, obviously they're really busy a lot of the time managing up and trying to, meet big agendas and tasks, but it would be great if they, if there was just more space to take time and nurture and support, I think, younger people when you start working, really.
I think, so I probably went about it quite judiciously in terms of knowing that, and kind of growing up with a father that was very sort of typical old school engineer. And for me, the kind of steps were kind of go in recognising that nobody was going to listen to me and being very, very aware of that, and sort of going in thinking, okay, nobody's going to listen to me. How am I going to be heard? And finding out, okay, who are the people that hold power in this organisation, who are the people that people listen to, and how do I tap into what they care about in order then to be heard through them, essentially. So it would either be through sponsorship and being pretty open about it and saying, hey, you're an important person. You say you care about this stuff, well, I care about it as well, and I don't know if you're doing the best job. I think you've got some great experience, but I also have some insights. Can I take you out for a coffee and have a chat about it and kind of prove my worth through the conversation? Recognise that I'm obviously in a much lower position, but be very proactive about looking for sponsors. And some people will say, will have views on how ambitious that is and so on. I'm like, I don't really care. And then the other thing I think that was important was learning what language people thought was important, and kind of recognising that what I may come in thinking, X, Y, Z was important for me to talk about, walking into a situation, realising they only value this, this, and this. So I was going to have to learn how to speak this language, speak this language, speak this language, get all the certifications that they thought were important. So that when they were like, oh, Yassmin, well, you haven't done all of these sort of things, I'd be like, no, got all of that. now listen to me. So there was a base level, which just means you have to work a lot harder. But there was a base level that I got to before people would start to listen, but kind of getting to that point, covering it off so that it doesn't even become a question. And then opening the doors up for others. I think that was also really important. It's like, okay, I got there. Now how do I help others and vouch for them so that they don't have to go through the same process that I do? It's hard work, but YOLO.
Oh, okay. I thought I'm looking at this clock thingy.
5
Well,
seconds.
I work in university, so it's really hard, and as a sessional academic, so it's really hard for me to even know, who my superiors are half the time, and so I guess like I like Timmah, I would go for mentorship. I always try, my poor mentor, she didn't offer to be my mentor. I just kind of was like, you're my mentor. Yes. And I really rely on her. But, she's not paid for that role. I guess it's now become a part of her work. But I could see how if she was a different kind of person, she could resent me for the emailing of questions and stuff. But given that an academic, a teaching academic gets no training, has no real supervision in any of those ways, is kind of just doing things purely on instinct, I think it's really crucial to find someone who can help you out without judging you. And it can be hard because sometimes that person is the person who will later give you work. So it's tricky to walk that line.
All right, we are out of time, but I'd like you to join me in thanking our 3 panellists, Briohny, Yassmin and Timmah.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.